This week I'm trimming the side plates you may have seen me throw in my previous video. They're exacting, simple forms with lots of sharp edges and turned footwells. I'll be sharing some tips and tricks I use when trimming shapes like this, and hopefully you guys will let me know which ones you like the best. I should begin this video though by mentioning the first part of this video if you haven't seen it yet. You can find a link to it on screen now and in the description below. It goes over how I throw these side plates using very soft clay, and like mentioned in that video, they're purposefully thrown quite thick as I want to trim these rather a lot, especially on the underside, as well as there being enough material on the top section for me to further define their shape. I've let these plates sit out overnight on the tabletop, the wooden surface drawing much of the moisture out of their bases, but a few of them have curled up slightly on the edges, so I'm just going to make a quick stack of those that have, layer them between bats and flatten them. Others are perfectly leather hard and ready to trim. Most importantly, for plates like this, I can pick them up at this stage and they shouldn't bend. If you happen to find you pick one of your plates up and it does visibly move, or sag to either side as you lift it, then it is still far too soft to be trimmed. This piece feels really solid, and the underside is just as leather hard as the walls and the top. But you can see how scruffy this is, especially the underside. So of course I am going to have to give each one a good trim, like I do for all my pots really. Now, I'm going to be trimming these not on the wheel head itself, but on a bat, as this means when it comes to flip the pot upside down so that I can turn its base, I can do so by placing another bat on top of it and then flipping the whole assemblage together, the plate sandwiched between them. This way, there's much less of a chance that the plate will bend, which could potentially happen if I were to just pick this piece up and flip it over by hand. I'm going to begin by trimming the top surface to make sure it's more or less perfectly flat. This is then scraped over with a metal kidney to soften any prominent turning marks. Then, as we're starting with the piece I said looked a bit like a dog bowl, I'm going to trim the outer flange to be a bit lower, which is of course something I should have done at the throwing stage. I'm also going to refine it so that it comes to a sharper point and with a beveled edge, not a blocky, squared one. Next, as I want to turn the sides, I place a spinner on top through which I can push down through to pin the plate in place. Here I'm just thinning out this portion of the pot and further straightening the wall. With all that mess then tidied up, I can burnish the rim smooth, and then, before I flip it over, I'm going to fill it up with some foam. This way, once flipped over, and when I'm trimming the base, there is some resistance beneath it, meaning that the base shouldn't sag in too much as I turn. Beyond this, using very sharp tungsten carbide tools when trimming the base helps more than you'd think, as you don't have to apply nearly as much downward pressure when using them, as compared to say a steel turning tool, which I'd have to push much harder into the bottom for it to remove clay properly, thus potentially causing this expansive clay to bow inward. I still do the first pass or two with a steel tool, that's what this one is, but hereafter, when it comes to hollowing out the footwell itself, I'll be switching to my tungsten tools. The last thing I do with the steel loop tool is just bevel the outer edge, as the relatively blunt metal leaves a lovely burnished surface, in a way that these tungsten tools don't. That's what I'm using now, and generally as they are so sharp they tend to tear the surface, leaving a somewhat scratched finish in comparison. This means there is always a bit of extra tidying up to do to remove the scratchy surface, but it only takes a moment or two. The plate can then be stamped, and I was confident with this piece that it was dry enough that I could lift it away like so. The interior surface is given a quick flattening. Really this is me just double checking it, as the last thing I want is for this surface to be convex, and that's the first very simple plate finished. I don't mind it. I think the undercut on the bottom really helps, as it makes the vessel feel lighter, and I look forward to seeing how it will look once softened by the glaze. Now, this piece is similar but different, and whilst I didn't want the rim on the previous plate to look blocky, that's precisely what I want with this piece. The rim is also about 3 times as thick, and I'm going to trim it to have really sharp corners on the top, so that the glaze breaks dramatically over them. The base on this piece felt a touch thick, so I'm trimming it from the top down to remove some of the excess weight. The plate, by the way, is held in place with some lumps of clay, just like the bat is. It's nothing fancy. The rim had a bit of an undulation to it, and so in order to correct that, I'm going to use just a very small portion of the blade to turn away the high point as it spins around. I only use a small portion, by the way, as it's just easier to control. I can hold the blade incredibly steady and just let it pick away at that high point until it spins level again. If this piece was stuck down to the wheel really firmly, then I might risk using the full length of the blade, but with it sort of precariously in place, it's simply safer to do it this way. Another MDF bat is then placed on top, and then I squeeze it all together and flip them over. You might think I'm being overcautious by doing this, but there's nothing worse than making a batch of plates that warp or crack or move too much once dried, or when bisque-fired, or when glazed and fired again. The truth is, if you bend a plate too much at this stage, even if you correct it and flatten the plate again, that stress the vessel underwent when being bent can come back to haunt you. So with plates, perhaps more than anything else, it's just better being safe than sorry. As I trim the bottoms of these, I'm constantly aware I'm looking for movement or any irregularity that might appear, as if this base suddenly dips on one side. That's a good sign that I've made it too thin and one portion of the plate has buckled. If you are trimming and you're unsure about the thickness of this portion of the pot, yes, you can tap it to see if it sounds hollow, which is normally a sign it's thinner, as compared to a low thud, which means it's thicker. But the best thing you can do is simply take the plate off the wheel and feel the cross-section with your fingers. This way you know exactly how much more material you can take off. And in a way, this is why being able to tap center, or just being able to center quickly, is so important. As if the pot you've made takes you 5 minutes to get in the middle, you're going to resent taking it off to check the thickness, as you know it's going to take all that time again to center the piece. Whereas if centering is something you can do in a matter of seconds, then there's no fear of taking the piece off, checking the thickness, and then putting it back. Next is the piece I'm probably most excited about trimming, with the angled section in the wall. Much of that part has actually been thrown really quite thick, so there's plenty of clay to remove from both the inside and probably from the underside too. None of these side plates are going to be light as a feather, but at the same time I don't want any of them to feel heavy. They can be slightly hefty. They're handmade plates after all, and ultimately they will have a thick layer of glaze coated over them, but that's simply another reason that I try and trim away as much as I can. If the surface looks a bit too scratched after using the steel kidney, I will switch to a Mud Tools plastic one, just to burnish over the surface and soften the clay. Next, the spinner goes down so I can pin the vessel in place, and now I can begin work refining the outer flange, crisping up the lip and creating a far more defined angle on the outside. I think this one's probably the least conventional. It feels rather cumbersome as a plate, but I really like it, and I'm looking forward to seeing what it looks like next to the bowls that inspired it. It's the rim section of these that gave me the idea. They're also, I think, some of my favourite pots I've made lately, and in next week's video I'm going to try scaling one up to see if I can achieve the same sort of finesse and finish on a much larger version. With the top and sides of this plate finished, I place some foam inside, place the bat on top, and then flip it over. For most of these I'm just hollowing out a simple footwell. The more intricate parts are on the top and sides anyway, so I feel like I don't want to overcomplicate the bases. And there's also not quite enough clay in them to do that, I think. If I'm not trimming with the spinner in the middle, my left hand often stays in the centre, pushing down ever so slightly to gently press the plate down and keep it from spinning out of control. With forms that are so low and wide, they can actually hold themselves in the centre really well. But without any pressure from above, they do sometimes come loose, like what just happened here. A sane person would secure the pot in place with some lumps of clay, but there are also other times where, if you feel like you can get away with it, well, that's what you do. Sometimes if the clay dries out too much, creating a really smooth, flush surface can be tricky. In that instance, this is what I do. I take a very lightly soaked sponge that's very dense, as the dense material leaves less texture in the clay. I can then burnish over this dampened surface with a plastic kidney, creating a much glassier and smooth finish. I then double check the fine rim just to make sure there's nothing wrong with it, and that's another one of these finished for now. Whenever it's raining outside, Churro decides that his warm bed underneath the radiator is no longer good enough, and he'll come and whine and want to be on my lap. Generally, he's a really good studio dog. He barks at crows on the roof and things, but normally he'll spend all day snoozing, or playing with one of his many balls that is somewhere in the workshop. The next plate is an interesting one, I think, as it's completely plain at this stage, a simple flat disc of clay that was thrown thickly so that there's plenty of material that I can trim back into fine. And in a way I think this one undergoes the biggest transformation, going from the piece that visually is the heaviest to one that looks beautifully light and refined. I begin by centering the plate, and then for the top surface of this one, all I'm going to do is define that curved shape. I want the top to be ever so slightly concave. This way, once glazed, the molten glass will fill this surface and make it flat, whereas if I left it totally flat and then glazed it thickly, the surface could actually become slightly convex, so the slight hollow really helps. I then flip it over, and this is where the real work begins. I'm going to trim a lot of clay away from the outer portion so that the form tapers to a finer point. A raised section in the middle is left, and I'll hollow out some material from inside this to form the foot. It's incredibly simple, and with this shape perhaps more than any of the others, it's imperative that I flip it back the right way round between two bats, as the thin, floating edge will be incredibly easy to warp. It's about as simple as a pot can get, but they are some of my favourite shapes to make, and I think there's a small batch of them I'll include in my next shop restock. By the way, if you would like a notification of when that would be, I recommend signing up to my newsletter, as that's where I always send out a notification that includes a price list and preview, normally the night before the shop goes live. I'll leave a link to this in the video's description. This next plate started out similar to the last, but for this one I'm turning an additional sloped section around the outside to create an outer flange that's visual more than anything, and its bottom, which you can see here, is trimmed almost like the last one but with a thicker centre, as overall this dish was much thinner than the last. And sorry for the loud hammering of the rain, there was an absolute downpour on the day I was trimming these. This following one is similar again, although this time the indent around the rim is far more severe, and I'll be turning it to have more of a pronounced foot. With all of these plates, I'm not sure if the underside is deep enough for me to glaze it. I suppose it depends on what glaze I'm using, but at the same time, I've always been interested in the contrast between the glassy, smooth surfaces versus the stoniness of the clay once fired. So in a way, I don't mind if they are left unglazed. It's tricky, really, as the glazes I use have to go on relatively thickly. This means that in many cases, if I want to glaze the foot of a vessel, I actually have to trim it deeper than you normally might have to, which, as a result, alters the actual shape of the pot itself, as it needs to be made thickly enough, or slightly taller than normal, as it needs to account for such a thickness of glaze in the foot. And normally, visually, on a plate at least, I don't like what this does, as it means they can look somewhat abnormally tall. Anyhow, I prefer this plate to the last, as the more indented rim creates more of a shadow and more of an obvious boundary. It's always a bit more tiring trimming shapes that you aren't familiar with, as there's much more back and forth and double and triple checking them to make sure the plates are trimmed finely enough, meaning today was a coffee heavy kind of day. The last one is the piece I'm perhaps most excited about trimming. It should be very simple to finish, as the steps are actually really well defined already, so I shouldn't have to turn them much. Although with such fine details like this, I'm going to have to be really careful about working them, so all it takes is one wrong move to completely annihilate one of those delicate steps. The fine edges of all these pots will make them more susceptible to chipping in the end, but in fact most pots are that are finely made. Very thin, delicate edges, if hit with a spoon, or if another pot is harshly placed on top of it, will likely chip, even if it is factory made. For me, there comes a point where I'd rather make work that's more interesting and unique, even if it means the object itself has to be used more carefully. If you want pots that will never break and are completely robust, then, to be honest, most handmade pots probably aren't for you. And the last thing I want is to create very smooth, rounded objects, with little interest, simple glazes, and not much personality. As long as these pots are washed carefully, they should be fine. But I also think the people that are buying my work, nowadays at least, often also lean towards collecting it. Meaning it often exists in a slightly different arena too, as compared to work that is just completely functional, without regard to artistry or the mind of the maker. Anyway, I'm going to show them each in succession now, and I'd love to hear which ones you like best. I'll leave a little number in the bottom left, so that you can more easily identify them. I'll be picking up the glazing and firing of these in a future video, but I'm in a making cycle at the moment, not a glazing and firing one, but all of that will happen in the coming months. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch, and I'll see you next time.